They threw her out at dawn, barefoot, bleeding, clutching a swollen belly no one wanted. Alpha Kale's rejection burned through her veins like venom, severing the mate bond with a cruelty that left her gasping in the frost-covered dirt. "No wolfless wretch will carry my heir," he'd snarled, his pack howling approval behind him. Serain stumbled into the Ashwood alone, the forbidden forest where outcasts went to die. She had no wolf, no pack, no name worth speaking. All she had was the child kicking beneath her ribs, and a single cracked river stone she'd carried since childhood, smooth on one side, jagged on the other. Just like her. The morning frost cracked beneath Serain's bare feet like tiny bones breaking. Each step sent a jolt of cold through her swollen ankles, up through her knees, settling deep into the ache of her 7-month belly. Behind her, the iron gates of Thornwall Pack clanged shut with a finality that echoed across the grey hills. She did not look back, not because she was brave, because she knew what she would see. The faces of wolves who had shared her hearth, eaten her bread, slept under roofs she'd patched with her own bleeding hands, now watching her exile with the same hollow disinterest they'd give a lame deer. Maren, the baker's wife, who had once called Seren sister. Torvin, the gate guard, who she'd taught to read. Lyra, the healer's apprentice, who owed Seren 3 favors and a winter coat. All of them standing in that gray morning light with their hands at their sides, and their mouths closed, because that was what Pack meant when the Alpha spoke. You obeyed, or you joined the one being cast out. Alpha Kale's voice still rang in her skull. Not the words themselves, but the tone. That flat, administrative cruelty, as if discarding a pregnant mate was no different from culling a weak calf from the herd. "No wolfless wretch will carry my heir." The mate bond, or what remained of it, throbbed like a severed nerve. She could still feel its phantom shape inside her chest, a thing that had once glowed warm and gold, and was now nothing but a cauterized stump. The rejection had been formal, spoken before the entire pack at the Moonfire altar. Kyle hadn't even looked at her when he'd said the words. He'd been adjusting his leather bracers, as though the dissolution of their bond was a minor inconvenience wedged between breakfast and training drills. Serain pressed her palm against the swell of her belly and felt the baby shift. A knee, maybe, or an elbow. The movement was insistent, almost angry, as if the child already understood what had been done to them. "I know," she whispered. "I know." The Ashwood rose before her like a wall of black teeth. The ancient forest that bordered Thornwall's northern territory was forbidden ground, not because of any official decree, but because of what lived inside it. Rogue wolves, feral shifters, things that had gone so deep into their animal nature they'd forgotten how to come back. Every pup in every pack grew up hearing the same warning: enter the Ashwood, and you don't come out. Serain entered anyway. There was nowhere else to go. The canopy swallowed the sky within 20 paces. The light turned gray-green, filtered through branches so thick they wove together like interlocking fingers. The air changed, too, heavy with the smell of wet bark, and something older, something mineral and deep, like the breath of the earth itself exhaling through layers of stone and root. The forest floor was soft, with centuries of fallen needles, and her bare feet sank slightly with each step, leaving impressions that filled slowly with dark water. Somewhere above, a raven called, a single harsh note that bounced between the trunks and died without echo. She had heard stories about the Ashwood her entire life. The elder women in Thornwall used to whisper them over mending baskets on winter evenings, tales of wolves who'd entered and emerged years later, mute and hollow-eyed, their human selves scraped away like bark from a dead tree. Tales of the Ashwood's ancient spirits, the ones that predated even the first shifters, who resented the presence of anything warm-blooded and showed their displeasure in subtle, accumulating ways. A compass that wouldn't point north. A trail that looped back on itself. The slow, creeping certainty that the forest was watching you with something more than animal attention. She walked until the cold became pain, and the pain became numbness, and the numbness became a strange, floating detachment from her own body. Her hand found the cracked river stone in her dress pocket, the one she'd carried since she was 6 years old, pulled from the creek behind her dead mother's cabin. One side smooth as glass, the other side raw, jagged, split by some ancient force. She rubbed her thumb across the smooth side the way she always did when the world pressed too hard. It was the only inheritance she had. The only proof that she'd existed before Thornwall, before Kyle, before any of this. A contraction hit. Not a real one, not yet, but a tightening that made her gasp and brace herself against a birch trunk. The baby pressed down, her vision spotted. "Not yet," she begged. "Please, not here." The ashwood didn't answer. It just watched her with its 1,000 dark eyes and waited, the way forests do, for what would happen next. The labor came 2 days later, under a sky so heavy with cloud, it felt like the world had sealed itself shut. Seren had found shelter in a half-collapsed woodcutter's shack at the forest's edge. 4 walls of rotting pine, a roof that leaked in 3 places, and a stone hearth so old the mortar had turned to powder. She'd gathered what she could. Moss for padding, rainwater caught in a rusted tin, strips torn from her own underskirt for binding. It wasn't enough. She knew it wasn't enough. A proper birthing needed a fire, clean water, someone with steady hands and knowledge of the cord. She had none of these things. What she had was stubbornness, which was a poor substitute for competence, but better than nothing at all. The contractions had started as a low ache in her back, almost indistinguishable from the constant pain of walking. But by nightfall they had sharpened into something architectural, great structural waves that felt as though her body was rebuilding itself from the inside out. She bit down on a strip of leather and breathed through her nose, counting the seconds between each one the way the elder midwife in Thornwall had once taught her. 4 minutes apart, then 3, then 2. The rhythm was relentless, biological, entirely indifferent to her fear. But the midwife wasn't here. No one was here. The metallic tang of blood filled the small space. Her fingers dug into the moss beneath her, and she felt the world narrow to a single point of blinding, obliterating focus. This was the moment, the hinge, the place where everything either held together or came apart. She pushed, and the forest outside went utterly silent. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of attention, as if every creature in the ashwood had turned its head toward the shack and was listening. The baby came in a rush of warmth and pressure, and a sound that Seren would later struggle to describe. Not a cry exactly, but a declaration. A small, fierce announcement of existence that split the silence like a stone thrown into still water. A girl, tiny, slick, impossibly alive. Serene pulled her daughter to her chest with shaking hands and wrapped her in the torn cloth and sobbed without sound, her mouth open against the baby's damp head. The smell of her, milk and iron and something impossibly clean, like new snow, cut through the stench of blood and mold and unwashed skin. "Rowan," she said. The name came without thought, rising from somewhere deeper than language. "Your name is Rowan." The baby's eyes opened. They were blue. Not the ordinary blue of new infants, but a deep, luminous blue that seemed to hold light the way the river stone held warmth. There was something behind those eyes, an awareness that shouldn't have been possible in a child less than a minute old. Seren had attended enough pack births to know that newborn pups didn't focus, didn't track, didn't look at you as if they were already measuring the shape of the world. But Rowan did. She looked at her mother with an intensity that was almost unsettling, as if she understood exactly what had happened and had opinions about it. Seren stared into those eyes and felt something shift inside her chest. Not the mate bond, something different, older, a tether between mother and child that was made of sterner stuff than any wolf magic. Not supernatural, but biological, cellular, written into the architecture of her body with an authority that no alpha could overrule. She pressed her lips to Rowan's forehead and whispered a promise she had no right to make. I will keep you alive, whatever it costs, whatever it takes. The bleeding wouldn't stop. Seren packed the wound with moss and pressed down and counted her own breaths, willing each one to be deeper than the last. She was dizzy. The edges of the shack blurred and swam. Rowan nursed with a desperate, instinctive hunger, her tiny fist pressed against Seren's collarbone, and Seren focused on that pressure, that small, warm weight, as an anchor against the dark tide pulling at the edges of her consciousness. She thought of Cale, not with love, not even with hatred, just with a cold, factual clarity. He had done this. He had thrown away something sacred because it came in a package he found embarrassing. A wolfless mate. A pup whose mother couldn't shift. In Thornwall, the wolfless were less than nothing. They were the broken ones, the shameful ones, the ones whose very existence was treated as a genetic insult to the pack's bloodline. Seren had endured it for years, the whispers, the sidelong looks, the way other wolves unconsciously stepped upwind of her as if her lack of wolf was a smell they could detect. And Cale, for all his initial tenderness when the bond had first snapped into place between them, had eventually bent under the weight of his pack's contempt. Pride had eaten him from the inside out, the way rot eats a tree, invisible until the whole thing falls. Seren tightened her arms around Rowan and looked at the cracked riverstone lying beside her on the moss. Smooth on one side, jagged on the other. She reached for it and pressed it against Rowan's tiny palm, and the baby's fingers curled around its edge with surprising strength. "That's yours now, too," she said. Outside, something moved through the trees, heavy, deliberate, the sound of paws on wet earth. Seren's blood went cold. 3 wolves circled the shack at dawn. Seren heard them before she saw them. The low, guttural breathing, the deliberate crunch of paws on frosted ground. She pressed Rowan tighter to her chest and backed against the far wall, her eyes fixed on the gap where the door had once hung. The first wolf appeared in the doorframe. Gray-black, massive, with scars scoring its muzzle like tally marks. Its yellow eyes locked onto Seren with an intelligence that was unmistakably human. A rogue. Not feral. Rogues still had their minds, still made choices, but dangerous all the same, because rogues had chosen to live outside the law. The wolf's nostrils flared. It had caught the blood scent. Seren's mistake was not the fear. Fear was rational. Her mistake was the calculation that followed, the desperate, exhausted arithmetic of a woman who had nothing left to bargain with except herself. "I can work," she said, her voice raw. "I can cook, mend, build. I'll earn my keep." The wolf tilted its head. Behind it, the other 2 pressed closer, their breath fogging in the cold air. A shift rippled through the gray-black wolf, bones cracking, fur receding, the grotesque and beautiful mechanics of transformation. Where the wolf had been, a man now stood. Tall, lean, with the same scars on his human face. His eyes were still yellow. "You're from Thornwall," he said. Not a question. "I was. Wolfless?" The word landed like a slap. Seren didn't flinch. She'd had years of practice. Yes. The man, she would later learn his name was Cade, looked at Rowan. Something shifted in his expression. Not softness exactly, but a recalibration. Rogues had their own codes, brutal and pragmatic, but there were lines even they recognized. "The child has wolf blood," he said. "I can smell it. Strong." Serene said nothing. "Thornwall threw you out because you're wolfless, but the pup isn't. Interesting." He crouched, bringing himself to her eye level. "Here's how this works. You stay in the Ashwood, you're on our ground. That means you owe tribute. Food, labor, whatever we need. In exchange, nothing touches you or the pup. Not ferals, not territory wolves, not anything." It was extortion dressed as protection. Seren knew it. But she looked at Rowan. 2 days old, already losing the warmth of the first feeding, already vulnerable to every danger in a forest full of predators. And she made the only choice a mother in her position could make. "Agreed." Cade nodded once and shifted back without another word. The 3 wolves melted into the Ashwood like smoke into fog. Seren slumped against the wall and pressed her forehead to Rowan's. The baby was asleep, miraculously, her tiny chest rising and falling with the perfect, oblivious rhythm of new life. "I just sold us to rogues," Seren whispered. The weight of it settled over her like a second skin. She had traded one form of captivity for another, Thornwall's contempt for the Ashwood's tribute. And she knew, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had survived by reading the intentions of those more powerful than herself, that Cade's interest in Rowan's strong wolf blood was not benevolent. Rogue packs were always looking for new blood. Wolves born with powerful lineage were currency in their world. She had, in her desperation, handed her daughter's future to wolves who saw the child as an asset. The cracked river stone sat in her pocket, warming against her thigh. She pulled it out and studied it in the thin gray light. The smooth side, the jagged side, the fissure running through its center like a scar that had never fully healed. It was supposed to represent something. Hope, maybe. Endurance. The idea that broken things could still be beautiful, still be held, still be carried forward. Right now, it just felt like a rock. Weeks passed, then months. Seren built what life she could from the wreckage of the one she'd lost. She patched the shack's roof with pine boughs and sealed the walls with river clay. She learned which mushrooms were safe and which streams ran clean. She paid Cade's tribute. Rabbits she snared, herbs she gathered, firewood she split with an axe she'd found rusted in the shack's corner. And Rowan grew. Not just grew, blazed. At 3 months, her eyes shifted from blue to amber when she was upset, a sign of wolf awakening so early it was almost unheard of. At 5 months, she growled at a fox that ventured too close to the shack, and the sound that came from her tiny throat was not a baby's sound. It was a wolf's sound. Cade noticed. He came by more frequently now, not for tribute, but to observe. He watched Rowan with the careful, calculating attention of a wolf assessing a valuable asset. His yellow eyes tracked her movements, noted her early developments, catalogued every sign that this child was something unusual. Seren saw it all and said nothing. She had learned, in her years as a wolfless woman in a wolf's world, that the most dangerous thing you could do was let powerful people know you understood their intentions. So she kept her head down, and her eyes open and her hands busy, and she held Rowan a little tighter each night, and she planned. Not an escape. There was nowhere to escape to. But a contingency, a set of options, however slim, that she could reach for if Cade's interest in her daughter crossed the line from observation to action. The riverstone sat on the mantel of the repaired hearth, catching the firelight each evening. Rowan liked to reach for it, and Seren always let her hold it, guiding her tiny fingers to the smooth side first, then the jagged side, as if teaching her by touch the central lesson of their lives, that everything beautiful existed alongside something broken, and the skill was in learning to hold both. Serene smelled him before she heard him, and she heard him before she saw him. It was early autumn, 9 months after the exile. Rowan was sitting on a deer hide outside the shack, methodically picking apart a pine cone with her small, fierce fingers, when the wind changed. It swung from the west to the north in a single breath, and it carried a scent so powerful, so layered, that even Serene, wolfless, scent-blind by pack standards, caught it like a fist to the sternum. Pine resin, iron, something electric, like the air before a storm. And beneath it all, a warmth that had no business existing in the ashwood. Something like cedar smoke and sun-warmed stone and the deep animal musk of a wolf so powerful its very presence reshaped the air around it. Rowan's head snapped up, her amber eyes went wide. And then she did something she had never done before. She howled. Not a cry, not a babble. A howl, clear, high, piercing, that rang through the ashwood like a bell and sent every bird within 100 yards skyward in a panicked rush of wings. The forest went still. And then he was there. He came through the tree line alone, which was the first impossible thing. No alpha traveled without a guard. The second impossible thing was his size. Not just tall, but massive, broad-shouldered, with the kind of physical density that spoke of a wolf form, large enough to bring down elk. He wore dark traveling clothes, leather and wool, practical, unadorned. But the way he moved made them look like armor. Every step was controlled, deliberate, weighted with an authority that didn't need announcement. His eyes were gold, not amber like Rowan's. Gold, deep, burnished, ancient gold, the color of old coins and harvest moons, and the kind of power that had been accumulating for generations. Alpha King Theron Ashvile. Seren knew him the way everyone knew him, by reputation, by legend, by the stories that filtered down through pack hierarchies like water through stone. The Alpha King, ruler of the 7 territories. The wolf whose bloodline stretched back to the first shift, whose authority was absolute, whose word could dissolve a pack with a single sentence. He was not supposed to be here. The Alpha King did not walk through rogue forests. The Alpha King sat on his throne in Ironhold Keep and adjudicated disputes between territories. He did not. He stopped. His gold eyes found Serene, moved over her with the clinical precision of a predator assessing a situation, and then dropped to Rowan. The world held its breath. Rowan stared up at him with her amber eyes and reached out one small pine-cone-stained hand. And the Alpha King, the most powerful wolf in the known world, knelt. He knelt in the dirt and pine needles outside a half-ruined shack in the middle of the ashwood, and he let a 9-month-old baby grab his finger. "Whose child is this?" His voice was deep, quiet, and it vibrated through the ground like a low-frequency tremor. Seren's mouth was dry. Mine. And the father? Alpha Kale of Thornwall. Something passed through Theron's eyes, a flash of recognition that hardened instantly into something colder. Kale rejected you. Yes. Meh. Because you're wolfless. Yes. Theron looked at Rowan. The baby was still gripping his finger, babbling happily, entirely unbothered by the fact that she was touching the hand of the most dangerous wolf alive. His expression was unreadable, but Seren caught something in the set of his jaw, the slight flare of his nostrils. He was scenting Rowan, deeply, reading the blood and lineage encoded in her tiny body. "This child carries the Ashvale line," he said. The words landed like a physical blow. Seren's vision narrowed. That's not possible. Kyle's grandmother was Ashvale born, made it out to Thornwall 3 generations ago. The bloodline diluted but didn't die. Theron's gold eyes lifted to Seren's. This child has more Ashvale blood than half my own court. I tracked the scent for 6 days. He had come for Rowan. That was why he was here. Not by accident, not on patrol, but because something in his blood had recognized something in hers, and the pull had dragged the Alpha King himself into the ashwood like a compass needle swinging north. Serene reached for Rowan instinctively, pulling the baby to her chest. "She's mine," she said. "I don't care whose blood she carries. She's mine." Theron studied her. The silence stretched. Then, very carefully, he said, "I'm not here to take her from you." "Then why are you here?" "Because an Ashvale pup is living in a rogue forest with no protection, no pack, and a mother who hasn't eaten properly in months." His gaze was steady. "I'm here because this is wrong, and I intend to make it right." The word spread through the territories like wildfire through dry grass. The Alpha King had claimed a wolfless woman and her pup, not mated, not yet, not formally, but claimed in the old way under the covenant of shelter, which meant they were under his direct protection. Anyone who touched them answered to him. Anyone who threatened them threatened the crown. It was unprecedented, it was scandalous, and it shook the political foundations of every pack in the 7 territories. Seren and Rowan were brought to Ironhold Keep 3 days after Theron's appearance in the Ashwood. The journey itself was a kind of violence. The transition from rotting wood and moss to vaulted stone and candlelight, from silence to the constant, overwhelming presence of wolves. Hundreds of them. The keep hummed with their energy, their scent, their hierarchy. And every single one of them stared at Seren. She felt it like a physical weight, the scrutiny, the assessment, the instinctive calculation that every wolf made when encountering someone new. Am I stronger than this one? Is this one a threat? And beneath those primal questions, the one that mattered most in pack society. Does this one have a wolf? Serene did not, and they could tell. Not by sight, she looked no different from any other woman, but by some absence in her scent, some missing frequency in the signal that all wolves broadcast constantly. She was a blank space in a world built on signals. It was the same feeling she'd known in Thornwall, but amplified 100-fold, because this wasn't a rural pack of 200 wolves. This was the seat of the crown, and the wolves here had spent their lives swimming in hierarchy, the way fish swam in water. They could detect a wolfless outsider, the way a musician could detect a wrong note. Instinctively, immediately, irrevocably. Rowan, by contrast, drew an entirely different reaction. Wolves who passed the child in the corridors would slow, turn their heads, inhale deeply, drawn by the Ashvale bloodline that sang through Rowan's veins like a high, clear bell. More than one grizzled warrior had stopped mid-stride to stare at the silver-eyed baby on Seren's hip, recognition flickering across their face before they caught themselves and moved on. The court was worse. Theron's council, 5 alphas who governed the territories under his authority, met her with reactions ranging from cold politeness to open contempt. Lord Vasek, the oldest, merely raised an eyebrow. Lady Marin, who controlled the southern territories, smiled in a way that showed too many teeth. But it was Councilwoman Drina who said what they were all thinking. "You expect us to accept a wolfless outcast into the king's household?" Her voice carried the particular venom of someone who believed she was speaking an obvious truth. "She cannot shift, cannot run, cannot fight. She is, with respect, a liability." Theron's response was quiet. "She survived 9 months alone in the Ashwood with a newborn. I suspect she can fight well enough." "Survival is not the same as belonging, Your Majesty." "No, Theron said. "It's harder." The council fell silent, but Seren could see the resentment hardening in their eyes, the alliances already forming beneath the surface. She had been in courts before, Thornwall's smaller, cruder version, and she recognized the machinery of exclusion when she saw it. They would smile to her face and undermine her at every turn. Rowan, meanwhile, was oblivious. She crawled across the stone floor of the great hall with the fearless determination of a child who had never learned to be afraid of wolves, and every time she laughed, the sound echoed off the ancient walls like something the keep had been waiting to hear. Then Kyle came. He arrived on the 5th day, riding hard, flanked by his beta and 6 warriors, his face a mask of controlled fury. The formal summons from the Alpha King had reached Thornwall like a blade between the ribs. Kyle had rejected a pup who carried Ashvile blood. He had exiled a woman who was now under the Crown's protection. In the political calculus of the territories, he had made a mistake so catastrophic it threatened his entire pack's standing. Seren saw him cross the courtyard from the north wing window and felt her body react before her mind could intervene. Her heart rate spiked. Her hands went cold. The phantom ache of the severed mate bond flared in her chest like an ember blown back to life. 9 months of survival, of building and bleeding and fighting for every breath. And still, the sight of him could reach inside her and find the bruise. He looked the same. That was the cruelest part. The same dark hair, the same squared jaw, the same way of carrying himself as if the world owed him ground to stand on. He hadn't suffered. She could see it in the ease of his stride, the fullness of his face, the unmarked quality of a life that had continued without interruption after he'd ended hers. But Cale was not a wolf who admitted mistakes. He was a wolf who doubled down. "The pup is mine by blood right," he announced in the great hall, standing before Theron's throne, with a defiance that bordered on suicidal. "I demand her return." Seren, standing to the side with Rowan in her arms, felt the mate bond scar flare white-hot. Not love, not longing, just pain, pure and structural, like an old fracture shifting in the cold. "You rejected both the mother and the child," Theron said from the throne. His voice was level, but the air in the hall had changed. Serene could feel it. A pressure, a density, the atmospheric shift that happened when an Alpha King let even a fraction of his dominance seep into the room. Several wolves near the edges of the hall lowered their heads involuntarily. "You forfeited your claim." "I forfeited a wolfless mate, not my heir. In the eyes of the old law, they are the same. You rejected the bond. The bond included the child." Kyle's jaw worked, his hands clenched at his sides. Serene saw the exact moment he made the worst decision of his life. "Then I challenge," he said, "for the pup, by combat right." The hall erupted. Wolves shouted, council members rose from their seats, and somewhere in the chaos, Rowan began to cry. A thin, high wail that cut through the noise like a blade. Seren clutched the riverstone in her pocket so hard the jagged edge broke skin. The combat challenge was ancient law, older than the territories, older than the crown itself. When invoked, it could not be refused. But the terms were flexible, and Theron used that flexibility like a weapon. "The challenge is not for the pup alone," he declared the following morning, standing in the stone arena at Ironhold's heart. The entire court had assembled, hundreds of wolves pressed against the tiered walls, their collective tension making the air thick and charged. "It is for the bond itself, the right to claim a family you discarded. And that, Alpha Kyle, is not decided by strength alone." Kyle stood in the arena's center, stripped to the waist, his body a map of muscle and old scars. He radiated aggression the way a furnace radiates heat, uncontrollable, indiscriminate. "The trial of bonds," Theron continued, requires 3 tests: strength, truth, and recognition. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The trial of bonds hadn't been invoked in over a century. It was considered archaic, a relic from an era when wolf law was more mystical than martial. The first test was simple. Combat, not to the death, but to submission. Chaol against Theron's chosen champion. The champion was a female beta named Sorrel, smaller than Chaol, faster, with a fighting style built on precision rather than power. The fight was brutal and beautiful, a storm of shifted fur and flashing teeth that lasted 11 minutes and ended with Sorrel pinned but Chaol bleeding from a dozen wounds that would scar. He passed. Barely. The second test was harder. Truth required the challenged party to stand before the accusing party and answer 3 questions without deception. Wolf senses could detect lies, the spike in heartbeat, the chemical shift in scent, and in a room full of wolves, deception was nearly impossible. Sarene stood before Chaol in the arena. Her hands shook, but her voice did not. "Did you reject me because I was wolfless?" Chaol's jaw tightened. "Yes." "Did you know I was pregnant when you cast me out?" A longer pause. The hall leaned in. "Yes. Did you care?" The silence that followed was its own answer. Chaol's scent shifted, something acidic, something shameful, and every wolf in the arena caught it. He opened his mouth, closed it. His eyes, dark and hard, met Sarene's for the first time since the rejection, and what she saw there was not cruelty. It was something worse. Indifference. At the time, he simply hadn't cared. She had been wolfless, and therefore she had been nothing. And therefore what happened to her had been irrelevant. "No," he said finally. "I didn't." The word detonated in the silence. Sarene felt it land in her chest, like a stone dropped into deep water, sending rings outward through everything she'd ever told herself about her exile. Every justification, every maybe he didn't know, every tiny fiction she'd built to make the abandonment survivable. He had known, and he hadn't cared. She reached into her pocket and wrapped her fingers around the riverstone. The jagged edge pressed into the cut it had made the day before, and the small, sharp pain brought her back to herself. The third test was recognition. And this was the one that undid everything. Recognition required the challenger to identify their claimed family member by scent, alone, blindfolded, from among a group of others. It was designed to prove the primal, unbreakable connection between parent and child, the bond that transcended politics and pride and every rational calculation. Chaol was blindfolded. 5 infants were brought into the arena, 4 from the court's nursery, and Rowan. They were placed in a row on soft furs, and the hall held its collective breath. Chaol moved slowly, methodically. He stopped at each child, lowered his head, breathed deep. His wolf senses were sharp, no one doubted that. He was a strong alpha with strong instincts. He stopped at the 3rd child, reached down, lifted the infant. It was not Rowan. The hall erupted. Chaol tore the blindfold away and stared at the child in his arms, a dark-haired boy from the court nursery, and then at Rowan, who sat 3 positions away, watching him with her amber eyes and an expression that, on an older face, might have been contempt. He had not recognized his own daughter. Theron's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "The trial is complete. The challenger has failed recognition. By the old law, his claim is void. The pup, Rowan, belongs to her mother, under the protection of the crown." Chaol's face went white, then red. He looked at Sarene, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes that she recognized. Fear, not of Theron, not of the court, but of the truth that the entire hall had just witnessed. He had thrown away something real, and he couldn't even identify it when it was right in front of him. Seren lifted Rowan from the furs and held her close. The baby buried her face in her mother's neck and made a small, contented sound. The sound of someone who had found exactly where she was supposed to be. Kyle left Ironhold at dawn, diminished in ways that had nothing to do with his wounds. His pack would feel the consequences for years. The political fallout of a failed trial of Bonds. The shame of an alpha who couldn't recognize his own blood. Alliances would shift. Trade agreements would be renegotiated. The slow, grinding machinery of territorial politics would extract its price, and Kyle would pay it in isolation, in lost standing, in the quiet erosion of the respect that was the only currency an alpha truly held. Seren watched him go from the keep's eastern parapet, Rowan balanced on her hip. She expected to feel satisfaction, or vindication, or at least the grim pleasure of seeing cruelty answered. She felt none of those things. She felt tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes not from physical labor, but from the long, slow work of carrying grief to the place where it can finally be set down. "You don't have to watch," Theron said from behind her. She hadn't heard him approach. For a wolf of his size, he moved with an almost unsettling silence. He stood beside her at the parapet, his gold eyes on the distant line of riders disappearing into the morning mist, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "I'm not watching him," Seren said. "I'm watching it end." Theron nodded. He understood the distinction. In the weeks that followed, something shifted at Ironhold Keep. Slowly, incrementally, the way seasons change. Not with a dramatic announcement, but with a series of small, accretive moments that built on each other like stones in a wall. Theron gave Seren quarters in the keep's north wing, a suite of rooms with a fireplace and windows that overlooked the mountain valley. It was more space than she'd ever had, and for the first 3 nights she slept on the floor because the bed felt like a lie. He did not push. He did not explain. He simply made space available and let her fill it at her own pace. Rowan, for her part, adapted with the terrifying ease of the very young. She crawled the keep's stone corridors with proprietary confidence, charming guards and terrifying diplomats in equal measure. Her wolf continued to develop at an accelerated rate. By her first birthday, she could partially shift her hands, producing tiny claws that she used primarily to shred important documents and claw the furniture. Seren began to learn the rhythms of the court. She sat in on council sessions, not as Luna, not as mate, but as the mother of a child under crown protection. She listened, she observed. And gradually the wolves who had dismissed her as a wolfless nobody began to notice something that didn't fit their assumptions. She was smart, strategically, politically, interpersonally smart. Years of surviving without a wolf in a wolf's world had given her an ability to read situations, to anticipate power shifts, to understand the mechanics of hierarchy in ways that wolves who had always been at the top never needed to develop. When Lady Maren attempted to undermine crown authority over the southern trade routes, it was Seren who noticed the pattern in the ledgers. When Councilwoman Drina tried to build an alliance against the king's new policies on wolfless integration, it was Seren who identified the pressure points. "You see things we don't," Theron said one evening, sitting across from her in the study, while Rowan slept in her crib nearby. "Because you had to. Because your survival depended on reading rooms that were designed to ignore you." Is that a compliment? It's an observation. And yes, the mate bond, the new one, the one between her and Theron, announced itself not with the violent snap of recognition that the stories described, but with a slow, dawning warmth. Like sunrise, like the river stone in her pocket, which she'd begun to notice was smooth on the side she pressed against her palm when she stood beside Theron, and jagged on the side she gripped when she faced the court alone. She didn't name it for a long time. Naming things made them vulnerable. But Theron knew. Of course he knew. He was an Alpha King with senses refined over a lifetime, and he had known since the moment he'd knelt in the Ashwood dirt and let Rowan grab his finger, known that the thread connecting him to this child extended to the child's mother, that the pull he'd followed through 6 days of forest was not just blood calling to blood, but something older, deeper, more fundamental. He waited, because he understood that Seren had been claimed before by a wolf who treated her as disposable, and that any new bond needed to be her choice, freely made, or it was just another form of captivity. "I'm wolfless," she said one night, standing at the window while autumn rain streaked the glass. "That won't change. Your court will never fully accept me." "I don't need their acceptance," Theron said. "I need yours." She turned to look at him. The gold eyes, the steady, certain calm that wasn't arrogance but something more durable, a confidence rooted not in dominance, but in the willingness to wait, to listen, to let broken things heal at their own pace. She pulled the river stone from her pocket and placed it on the windowsill between them. "Smooth on one side," she said, "jagged on the other." Like most things worth keeping. She almost smiled. That was very nearly charming. "I've been practicing." 3 years later, the river stone sat on the windowsill of the Luna's chamber in Ironhold Keep. It had been joined by others, a collection that Rowan had started, because Rowan collected everything. Feathers, acorns, interesting sticks, the occasional indignant beetle. But the original stone held its place at the center, and every morning Seren reached for it the way she'd once reached for it in a rotting shack in the Ashwood. Not because she needed it to survive anymore, but because the texture of it, smooth and jagged both, reminded her of the distance she'd traveled. Luna. The word still felt strange on her tongue, still drew whispers in certain corners of the court. The wolfless Luna. An oxymoron, a contradiction, a living challenge to every assumption the pack world held about power and worth. But the whispers were quieter now, not because Seren had proven herself, though she had, repeatedly, in ways that even her most stubborn detractors struggled to deny, but because the pack had begun to see something that Theron had seen from the beginning. Strength was not measured by the ability to shift. It was measured by the ability to endure, to adapt, to love fiercely in the face of every reason not to. Rowan was 3 and already terrifying. She could fully shift, a small, silver-coated wolf pup with her mother's determination and her biological father's raw power filtered through whatever ancient Ashvale magic ran in her blood. She ran the keep's corridors like she owned them, which, technically, she did. She called Theron Papa with the casual authority of a child who had decided that biology was a suggestion and love was a fact. Theron had adopted her formally under the covenant of the crown, a ceremony that had required the council's unanimous approval and which Seren had watched with dry eyes and a full heart, because she had learned that some emotions were too large for tears. The wolfless integration policies were slow, imperfect work. Generations of prejudice did not dissolve because a king decreed it. But the changes were happening. Small, structural, incremental. Wolfless members admitted to pack councils, protections codified in territorial law, a school at Ironhold that taught wolf and wolfless children side by side. Seren oversaw most of it. Not because Theron asked her to, but because she understood something about systemic exclusion that no wolf-born advisor ever could. She knew where the walls were because she'd spent her life pressing against them. Kyle. She thought about him sometimes, late at night when the keep was quiet, and Theron slept beside her with one arm draped across her waist. Not with hatred, not with forgiveness either. That was a word people used when they wanted tidy endings, and Seren's ending was not tidy. It was real, which was better. She thought about him with a distant, clinical clarity. He had been a lesson, a painful one, carved into her in blood and frost and loneliness. But a lesson nonetheless. He had taught her what love was not, and that, in the end, had made it possible for her to recognize what love was. The morning light came through the window and caught the river stone, illuminating the fissure that ran through its center. Seren traced it with her fingertip, the crack that split smooth from jagged, old from new, the before and the after. "Mama!" Rowan burst through the door in human form, her silver hair wild, a beetle cupped in her palms. "Mama, look! It has green on its back!" "Very impressive. Please don't let it go near the council chambers again." "But Councilwoman Drina screamed last time, and it was so funny." "Rowan!" "Fine." Seren watched her daughter deposit the beetle carefully on the windowsill beside the stone collection, and then sprint back out of the room with the boundless, directionless energy of a 3-year-old wolf pup who had the entire world ahead of her, and not a single reason to be afraid of it. Theron appeared in the doorway, 2 cups of tea in hand, one eyebrow raised. "Beetle?" he asked. "Beetle." He handed her a cup and kissed the top of her head. It was a small gesture, unremarkable, domestic, the kind of moment that would never make it into the legends that the bards were already composing about the wolfless Luna and the Alpha King. But it was the moment Seren would remember. Not the trial, not the exile, not the forest or the cold or the blood. This, the tea, the sunlight on the stones, the sound of Rowan's laughter echoing down the hall, the warmth of a bond that had not been demanded or declared, but had simply grown, quietly, like a tree in a forest, until it was strong enough to hold the weight of everything that had come before. She pressed her thumb against the smooth side of the river stone, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that both sides of her matched. Thank you for listening. If this story made your heart race, your eyes sting, or your soul ache, you felt exactly what Seren felt. And that means you're one of us. Hit that like button if you believe the wolfless deserve to be seen. Subscribe so you never miss another story of outcasts, fated bonds, and wolves who fight for the ones they love. Drop a comment below. Which moment hit you the hardest? Was it the rejection, the trial, or that quiet scene with the tea and the beetle? Share this video with someone who needs to believe that broken things can still be held. Ring the bell. Join the pack. We'll see you in the next one.